The issue with some modern views of consciousness in relation to the claims of the previous article is less one of reductionism as much as inversion. We might start with Daniel Dennett, who thought that mental representations are not things that are phenomenologically real but simply intentional objects misread by beliefs about them. When you seem to see a red horizontal stripe, there is no red stripe in the world, no red stripe on your retina or in your brain. There is no red stripe anywhere. There is a representation of a red stripe in your cortex, and this cortical state is the source, the cause of your heartfelt conviction that you are in the presence of a red stripe. You have no privileged access to how this causation works. We have a good theory of how color perception works, with its opponent processes and refractory periods, so you can probably explain the early or distal links in the causal chain from eyeball to conviction, but you simply don't know what the proximal or immediate causes are that put you into a state of subjective conviction and the attendant further sequelae, and then what happens? And this is true of your access to normal, not illusory vision as well, of course. The red stripe you seem to see is not the cause or source of your convictions, but the intentional object of your convictions. In normal perception and belief, the intentional objects of our beliefs are none other than the distal causes of them. I believe I am holding a blue coffee mug and am caused to believe in the existence of that mug by the mug itself. The whole point of perception and belief fixation is to accomplish this tight coalescence of causes and intentional objects. Hence, for Dennett, to believe qualia are real is to fall for an illusion of believing that representations have some inherent property outside of their causal relationships within the brain. Thus, there is simply nothing additional to speak of. What are intentional objects made of? They're not made of anything. When their causes don't coalesce with them, they are fictions of a sort, or illusions. By these lights, the difference between representations of blood sugar level or vitamin deficiency that modulate our digestive systems is one of seeming to have existence, and said seeming is a belief akin to stage magic. Dennett believes therefore that illusionism should be the default position. We philosophical illusionists say that before you run off half-cocked with theories about consciousness as one sort or another of real magic, you should try to explain it all as an illusion engendered by nature. When philosophers rely on what follows from their most undeniable intuitions about consciousness, before exhausting the physical possibilities, they are not adopting a sound method of inquiry, but simply indulging themselves. Dennett believes, conveniently, that explaining the details of how the brain manages to create the illusion of phenomenality is a daunting task, largely in the future. In other words, he believes not just in illusionism, but in a kind of pragmatic illusionism, that we should assume that physical nature concocts the illusion of consciousness, and that we can explain it, in the same way that stage magic has an explanation that has to do with physical events occurring behind the curtain, rather than assuming real magic to be the answer. Thus we are already saved from the hard problem and any of its fanciful corollaries and bad analogies or endless discussions of what it means to consider what it's like to be a bat. Yet what does it mean to seem to see a red horizontal stripe? By Dennett's lights it means to believe or you are seeing a red horizontal stripe. There is no thing that is experienced and it can't be found anywhere you look physically. Thus, it is just a kind of elaborate fiction which produces a seeming. But how can this be so? What does it mean to believe that I only seem to be having the experience of seeing this computer screen without any having of the experience? The answer, to be cynical, is essentially a complex verbal wordplay, whose sole purpose is to assert the superiority of the scientific perspective as an all-encompassing truth, rather than just a way of describing and predicting things. Think for example about the idea that a red horizontal stripe is simply an intentional object, basically the object of a belief or intent. Then so is the idea that there is an intentional object, so are any objects of all thoughts. To assert anything is we must have some concrete axis point, but Dennett's perspective depends upon the claim to be standing upon a view from somewhere apart from consciousness that can declare in the third person that things experienced in the first person don't have any phenomenal existence. If a red horizontal stripe is an intentional object, then so are neurons and synapses. They are just representations of things whose aboutness is no more ground to not be an illusion than anything you think. Even if you suggest that the scientific method somehow subverts this position from somewhere problem by prediction and testability, it does so only as a heuristic, not as an actual description of what things are. And since the seeming of conscious experience presents you with an inherent what things are within the domain of experiencing something, to suggest we make it an assumption that we start from a position of illusionism, while not even having any proof whatsoever within that scientific heuristic for how or why the brain actually is deluding itself, then the position is just an ideological one based around distaste for other people's attitudes towards their own experience. Indeed, if we are presuming the brain to be inclined to have delusional beliefs, I would imagine there is more reason to conceive of why an illusionist would subjectively prefer to have that belief. Most people know Daniel Dennett as one of the four horsemen of New Atheism, a movement as dogmatic as it was philosophically inept. Dennett's illusionism is pretty much a tandem of his view of other people's beliefs in plenty of areas, so much so that it seems obvious it's an inclination of his personality. I, for example, am not inclined to think that when I see red, I am actually delusionally believing that I am having the phenomenal experience of seeing red, because I have a different personality. I would argue that for the sake of simplicity, since we are not arguing from proof but from what we should presume, that most people's belief that they are having real subjective experience with intrinsic qualities is less likely to be a self-indulging fiction than the belief that other people are all deluded that attends the proclivities of New Atheism. But either way, this philosophical attitude is entirely circular. Let's say we map the entire of the brain, every neuron and synapse, and we find some part of it that we can manipulate so that you can either believe or not believe you are having an experience of red. What does that tell you about whether the experience of red exists? Nothing. No more than the fact that I could do so with the belief that Donald Trump is or isn't president, which unfortunately I seem to believe he is. Yet I would argue that such a part of the brain won't ever be found because there is no propositional content in an experience of red, it's just an experience of red. The issue here resolves upon what we are actually calling an ontological primitive. If we suggest that the seeing of red is an illusion, the fundamental reason is not actually because we believe it to not coalesce with its causation, but because we believe the thing that it is something else, that red or blue or happiness or goodness or ideas or representational objects are less real in nature than atoms or electrons in their physical properties and concomitant scientific laws. But what does that tell you about what anything is? Nothing. It just describes a phenomenon without actually bypassing its presence in a mind. If we begin with the basic position of taking consciousness seriously, then we can reconsider this argument. If I see a red stripe, that red stripe does not exist in the world, in my retina, or in my brain, so where does it exist? Well, perhaps there is another way of putting it. I have an experience of a red stripe, or to be less abstract, an entire whole cohesive conscious experience full of sights and sounds, thoughts and feelings. Said experience exists because I am experiencing it. It doesn't exist physically in my retina, in the world, or in my brain, so why do we not conclude that those things are intentional objects, and the experience itself is the thing that is? I agree with the illusionists in the basic conclusion that the things we experience are the sum of their causal properties, in the sense that nothing additional exists that necessitates a kind of dualism or a psychophysical law, as David Chalmers likes to put it, to explain the difference between matter with and matter without mental states. But if that is true, you are begging a question about your ontology, to fit consciousness into the view of what reality is that is preferred by someone like Dennett. You must conclude that to say that conscious states are the sum of their properties is to essentially say that they don't exist, or at least as they seem to, but you cannot suggest they don't exist purely because they are their causal properties. Because causal properties are descriptions, instead you are subtly arguing that because they have causal properties they are made of something else, matter. But matter, or let's say atoms, are also the sum of their causal properties. Science says nothing about what they are any more than it does about redness or sunsetness. The only way to end with a position that doesn't beg dualism or the dreaded qualia is an idealist conception of reality. As they say, change my mind.